In this lecture, as we continue thinking about Romans chapters 1 through 4, I want to talk a little bit about a couple of the issues that come up and then define a few words. The first issue I want to talk about is a little bit of kind of an excursus on general revelation. In chapters 1 and 2 of Romans, we get the sense that Paul believes that God has revealed himself to all people. In chapter 1, we learn that God has revealed himself through what God has made, through creation. And in chapter 2, we find that God has revealed himself through an inner sense of conscience, a sense of right and wrong, a sense of those thoughts that both accuse or acquit us within our own moral conscience. Now, many theologians have built on these two statements of Paul and others from throughout the Old and New Testament a theology of general revelation. General revelation in theology is the idea that God has revealed God's self to all people everywhere. In other words, that everyone, no matter where they live, no matter what their culture or language or their socioeconomic status, have access to genuine knowledge about God. And if we use these two passages from Romans into that conversation, it would appear that this knowledge of God is accessible through the world around us, the created order, and through our own inner sense of morality, a sense of right and wrong. Now, of course, theologians differ as to the extent of how much can be known about God through these sources. Paul says in Romans 1 that because of this knowledge of God through creation, people are without excuse, so there's a moral culpability. But other theologians have wondered, is it possible to know God in a saving way? In other words, lacking the gospel, lacking any knowledge of Jesus, is it possible to be reconciled to God or somehow have a relationship with God through this general knowledge of God? And there is no consensus among Christian theologians on this topic. Some say yes, some say no. And I encourage you, if you're interested in this topic further, to explore that issue on your own. Another little excursus I want to talk about is the question of who is the true Jew. In chapter 2, verses 28 and 29 of Romans, Paul writes these words. He says, reading from the NRSV, "A person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is true circumcision something external and physical. Rather, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and real circumcision is a matter of the heart. It is spiritual and not literal. Such a person receives praise not from others, but from God." And this, of course, is a question about whether the church has superseded Israel, and that Christians, whether they are ethnically Jewish or not, have resumed and gathered into themselves the promises that God originally made to Israel, or whether God still sees the promises that he made to ethnic Israel as being truthful, valid, and that he will, in fact, fulfill at some point in the future. Some read this passage from Romans chapter 2 as a clear statement that truly Jewish people, in light of the coming of Jesus, are people who have responded to the message of Jesus, whether they are ethnically Jewish or not. And so in this interpretation, it would mean that only followers of Jesus are truly Jewish in the sense that Paul is defining Jewishness in his letter to the church in Rome. And this view has had a long history and legacy within the church. But unfortunately, that history and legacy in the history of the Christian church has often been fed and accompanied by an anti-Semitism that's existed in the church, that views people who are ethnically Jewish but don't trust in Jesus with a kind of prejudice or a kind of presupposition about them. There are others who interpret this passage as simply a statement that those who are ethnically Jewish and also trust in Jesus, that these are the people who are truly Jewish in the sense that Paul is using in the book of Romans. And therefore that this statement is not describing non-Jewish Christians, but only Jewish people who have responded to the message of Jesus as the Messiah. And this latter view would see the people of Israel as still beloved by God, as the promises that God made to the people of Israel as still somehow being kept in the future, and the covenant God made with the people of Israel as still being valid. So these are the two particular ways that people have viewed this particular issue of who is truly Jewish. Finally, I want us to talk a little bit about some of the words that we encounter within Paul's letter to the Romans in the 3rd and 4th chapter. And I want to read starting in verse 24 of Romans chapter 3. Paul writes, "They are now justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a sacrifice of atonement by his blood, effective through faith. He did this to show his righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he has passed over sins previously committed." I want to talk about three terms that we encounter here: the word justified, the word redeemed, and the phrase sacrifice of atonement. Let's begin with the word redeem or redemption. This word redeem was originally used of people who had been taken captive as slaves and whose freedom had been purchased, so they were now free from slavery. And so whenever Jewish people or people acquainted with the Hebrew Scriptures heard the word redeemed or redemption or the verb redeem, they immediately thought of the Exodus story. How God's people, the people of Israel, had been held as slaves by the Egyptians. That God worked powerfully through Moses and through Aaron to bring them out of their slavery and into freedom. In fact, in the Hebrew Scriptures, often in the preamble to God reaffirming his covenant with the people of Israel, God will say, "I am the Lord your God, who has redeemed you from the house of slavery." And so the word that Paul uses here for redeem conjures up the story of Israel and God's deliverance of the people of Israel from their slavery in Egypt. Next, I want to talk about justification, or the verb would be justify. Here in Paul using this word, he draws it from the world of Greco-Roman legal society, specifically the Greco-Roman court. And the image Paul uses is if someone has been accused of breaking a law, or the technical word would be transgressing or stepping over a legal boundary within society, that person would be accused of being a lawbreaker, of being a transgressor, and would be summoned into a court. And in that courtroom, they would stand before a judge, and that judge would evaluate the evidence and either declare them guilty of what they are accused of, or not guilty of what they're accused of. If a person accused of breaking a law, accused of being a transgressor, was found not guilty or acquitted of the accusation, the word that would be used is that they were justified, or that they experienced justification. Justification means to be legally made right in relationship to the law. And so, of course, the image here is that the entire human race is guilty of transgressing or stepping over the boundaries of God's law. And because of that, we are accused of being transgressors. And so we are summoned to God as judge, as the one who created that law. And then Paul's argument is that though we are guilty of transgressing God's law, that through Jesus and his perfect life, where he never transgressed God's law, an exchange happens. That our guilt of transgressing the law of God is brought over to Jesus and taken upon himself, and that his innocence in regard to the law of God is transferred over to us. So through faith in Christ, we are acquitted, declared not guilty, or to use Paul's word here, justified in relationship to God's law. We are no longer viewed as transgressors or as lawbreakers, but we are viewed as innocent in regard to the law of God. And as a consequence, we are legally made right with God as a result of our faith in Jesus. The third phrase I want to talk about from this passage is translated here in the translation I read, sacrifice of atonement. Some translations translate it propitiation or expiation. The translators of the NRSV prefer the phrase sacrifice of atonement. In some early English translations, such as Wycliffe and Tyndale's translations, it was translated mercy seat. And the image here also goes back to the Hebrew Scriptures and the fact that in ancient Israel, first in the tabernacle and later in the Jewish temple, there was an altar. And in that altar was a place called the mercy seat. And at that mercy seat is where the animal sacrifices were offered by the Jewish priests in order to cover or atone for the sins that had occurred among the people of Israel. And so using this image, Paul describes Jesus and his death as the place where atonement has been made. A place where the guilt of our sin has been met with forgiveness. That through Jesus, this is the place where forgiveness occurs. So these three terms, redemption, justify or justification, and sacrifice of atonement, frame Paul's understanding of the cross and of what Jesus has achieved through his death on the cross on behalf of the human race.